Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Today we have with us D. Raghunandan, President of the All India People Science Network, to discuss the recent events in Uttarakhand, which has been a major disaster for the country. Raghu, a lot of people have been talking about this being an effect of an extreme weather event connected to climate change. But in the immediate aftermath of this, the real issue is the kind of failures that have taken place in two aspects. The kind of environmental development that has taken place there, leading to certain essentially disasters waiting to happen, if you will, and the kind of disaster management that has not really occurred except now, which seems to have picked up. So one part of it is the extreme weather events correlating to climate change is rather difficult, even if it may be. So we'll come back to the issue later. But immediately, what really has led to the large disaster that has taken place in Uttarakhand?
I would think there are two major issues at hand in Uttarakhand which have led to the scale of disaster as we have seen it. One is the number of habitations which have come up at the level of the river or more. If you look maybe 30-40 years ago, with the extent of rainfall that we have seen now, we would have seen cloudbursts, we would have seen roads and mountainsides collapsing in landslips, and therefore affecting settlements on the slopes. And as you probably know, settlements in Uttarakhand in the villages are not very large. There will be maybe 100 households in a village, or maybe even less. Over the years, what has happened is you've got very large settlements, extensions of towns, townships, which have come up on the banks of the major rivers, which were earlier either uninhabited or inhabited in very small townships. Today, they have grown into very large towns. And those large towns, how and where permissions were given to build to such an extent, whether at all there has been a permission given, how many of these are legal or illegal settlements, nobody knows. The point is they are very ad hoc. Settlements have come up in a completely haphazard manner, and that has been a disaster waiting to happen.
So there are, a lot of them are on the close to the river beds.
Close to the river.
So if there is a flash
flood,
or a
flood
affected.
even, then they will immediately get hit, and the damage is very severe because the
numbers are large.
Numbers are much larger. On top of that, today you have got the Yatra route pilgrims, all of whom go through the same major towns because that's where the roads go through, adding to the population in these
and that's why the towns have really come up. That's
and
the reason for the towns also.
Exactly. So the point is, you have built roads, you have built them in a certain way, you have oriented them around the big towns, you have allowed the big towns to become even bigger, thinking that they will attract people. House owners have invested money, property sharks have invested money there and built high-rise, what should be called high-rise building, 5-story, 6-story buildings in Uttarakhand, not particularly on a not particularly stable soil and mountainside. These are disasters waiting to happen.
So this is one part of it.
This is one part.
Second part of it, which has been also talked about, is that a lot of the tunneling, dams, etc. that has been done, they have left a lot of the soil and whatever debris right there. And as a result, when the flood came, it also washed down huge amounts of this kind of loose debris soil that was left. And that has also contributed to the magnitude of the disaster. How correct is this?
Absolutely right. In fact, it's not only that there's the blasting, the road making, various other construction activities which are taking place, which leave debris on site. But even worse, they dump the debris also down the slopes into the river. Now this is made for two things. One is you have loose debris lying around, which if water comes there, washes the debris into the towns or into settlements or on the roads. but also this has meant a large amount of silt and debris in the rivers, which has raised the floor of the river, which means that it is easier for the river to flood. If the river had been deeper, it would have taken more water. But with the amount of debris which is in the river, it's raised the level and therefore made overflowing the banks of the river that much easier. So on both counts, there has been a big disaster-prone method of thing. There is no systematic immediate removal of debris which should be done in all circumstances, never done. And in many cases you will see debris is generated and the contractor will just roll it down the hillside into the river.
Other part of it, there are two larger issues involved here. One is, as we've already said, the question of regulations, environmental rules and so on, in an area which is ecologically sensitive and also relatively unstable, because the Himalayas are young mountains. Unlike the Andes and a lot of other mountains, they're young mountains. Absolutely. So therefore there has always been this issue of landslips and so on. The other part of it is that you have this huge growth of the pilgrims. Now, this was something which was supposed to be a very difficult route once upon a time. As you know, this Char Dham, which is being talked about. These were really places where very few people could go because it was so difficult to reach. Now that you have helicopters, you have buses, you have roads, so the pilgrim numbers have grown astronomically. Now, does it not need, therefore, a proper planning to both handle the kind of pilgrims that are coming in, how they should be housed, where they should be housed, what is possible for them, and also, if there is a disaster, how to have a disaster management plan to handle the kind of things that we have now seen, isolated pilgrims in different places, no food, nothing, no shelter. And this has really caused a huge number of deaths.
I'll come to the disaster management part a little later, but the first part of the question that you've raised is, I honestly believe that a large part of the new infrastructure, the roads that have been built, have been quite recent phenomena in Uttarakhand and in this part of Uttarakhand in particular. If you compare it with the Kumaon region, or if you compare it with Himachal, you will find that the infrastructure in the Garhwal region of Uttarakhand is very poor. And a lot of it is recent and much of it is half made. So in fact, when roads have been built, they have been rough cut into the mountainside, which, as you rightly said, is very unstable hill slopes. So proper reinforcement is not done. So even the infrastructure is not particularly great. And with the large pilgrim rush that you're talking about, those who have gone on the Chardham Yatra even now will testify to large stretches of the route which are very difficult to traverse, which are very unstable, and even low rainfall, much less than what we have witnessed in the downpour now, has led to landslips, roads being blocked, hours taken for buses to go. So if at all you want to plan, it is clearly under capacity infrastructure for the kind of pilgrimage that you expect. Or you can look at it the other way, you are carrying more pilgrims than you have built infrastructure for. In either case, there is an under capacity, and the quality of the infrastructure that you have built is also nothing like what is required, either in terms of roads or in terms of accommodation or in terms of what can be done. I have seen many large towns in this region where water is piped up from 4,000 feet below, piped water coming up from the river to feed an entire township. I mean, this kind of infrastructure planning is not going to result in anything except instability, unplanned growth, overpopulated or under capacity.
So this is one part of it, the capacity of the system to handle the size of pilgrims that are coming now in terms of numbers just wasn't enough.
The capacity is not even sufficient to support the population that you've got there in terms of the townships, leave alone the new floating population that will flood the place.
That's a very large number, because if you see the number of pilgrims, they are much more than the population of these places. The second part of it, the disaster management. Again, it is known that this region is prone to both earthquakes and to flash floods if there is a cloudburst of any magnitude. So therefore, it demands that you have a disaster management in place, particularly if we're talking of crores of pilgrims who are now coming into this Char Dham Yatras and other places. So what is the disaster management that the government of India has in place?
To put it very simply, there is no disaster management taking place. And even worse, there is no disaster preparedness. The first thing that any disaster management system looks to do is to make disaster preparedness plans to anticipate what could happen. Then disaster management is, once something has happened, maybe it's happened more severely than what you do, it's a question of how to tackle it. In fact, even under normal circumstances, if there is no yatra, when the monsoon takes place, the system in Uttarakhand is unprepared for any kind of flash floods, landslips, landslide. It takes hours, if not days, for any kind of relief or rehabilitation to enter that place. In the face of this flood of pilgrims, the large unplanned habitations that you have got, there is absolutely no disaster preparedness that one can envisage, that one can see, nor is there, as you can see now, any disaster management having been put in place. Today, all that we are witnessing on the television channels is the army and the paramilitary being called in. That means apart from the army and the paramilitary, there is no civil administration. One doesn't see the home guards or the territorial army. One does not see the civil administration. Then there is, if that is the case, then there is no disaster management. If the army has to be called in, that's an emergency measure.
I can even understand the army being called in because honestly,
that's right. The scale is very large.
Any large disaster, we always had the army being called in. The question is, civil administration is the one which is to take advantage of the army being called in. So, assuming that they can deploy resources at a very quick speed, which is what the army can do, and the Air Force can do, helicopters and so on.
That's right.
It really needs by what plan will they act? Where will the food packets be dropped?
Exactly.
Spatial planning,
exactly.
geography of the region. Those are really the issues. And you can see it has taken almost 7 days before what they can say that we have now really streamlined our disaster efforts.
And even that, let me tell you, the reports I have from our workers in the field is that the focus right now as far as the disaster management is concerned is evacuation of pilgrims, which basically means non-residents, how to get them out of this area. That's been the focus. So the helicopters have gone in, they've been pulled out, some medicines have been dropped, some food packets have been dropped. But as you said, the civil administration is supposed to streamline this operation. Now what you've got, for example, is 8,000 pilgrims waiting in a spot. The helicopter comes in and moves out 40 at a time. Which 40 are to go first? This is something which the civil administration should organize, otherwise you have chaos. You have panic there, you will have people fighting with one another. Unless there is a civil administration locally to streamline this operation, the helicopter pilot is not going to be able to handle this operation. So that's a big problem. The second thing is, I still feel, the reports that I am getting is that the focus being so much on evacuating the pilgrims and those who have come outside, I think scant attention is being paid to the local inhabitants who have suffered.
Who have been affected very badly.
Very badly. You see, if you look at the big towns, Rudraprayag, or in the main pilgrim centers in Badrinath and particularly in Kedarnath, their attention is there because you also have, the big towns are also where the pilgrims go. But numerous small habitations, villages have been washed away by the rivers, by the landslips. Nobody is paying attention to them. In fact, the director of the disaster management agency in Uttarakhand has said, our focus right now is on the big towns and settlements, and where the big populations of people are who need to be moved out, the small people we will think about later. So you can imagine, if already we have witnessed 10 days have gone by with all this, imagine the plight of the local inhabitants who are there, who have been in a sense, the perennial victims to this
neglect,
poor development, lack of development, misplaced development. They are the perennial sufferers, and they are continue to be suffering even now.
Even when there is a disaster.
Even when there is a disaster.
The last issue, and this because it's sort of been talked about a lot, that this was a very unusual cloudburst. 300 millimeters of rain has not taken place in the last 150 years. So this is something very, very unusual. Now, of course, we will have also related to climate change because, as you know, that one of the impact of climate change is extreme weather events. Now, do you think that we can correlate an extreme weather event of this magnitude to climate change? Or do you think that what we see is a number of such extreme weather events, and therefore, though cause and effect cannot be established, statistically we see much more of them today than ever before. So therefore, it's really a generic conclusion rather than a specific one.
Absolutely right. We know that due to climate change, monsoons are coming in India later than they should, than their scheduled time, by about 2 weeks or so in different parts of the country, 10 days in some regions, 15 days in other regions. This has been the general pattern. But now, in this year, we've actually had the monsoons coming before time.
2 weeks before almost.
That's right, almost. So, the issue with climate change is a greater unpredictability of the climate. So, it's not always just unidirectional, but unpredictability. The second thing that we do know about climate change is the extent of heavy rainfall. The number of days of heavy rainfall have been steadily increasing. This is very clear from meteorological data that we've had the experience of the Bombay rains, for example, where you had almost the entire year's quota falling in a matter of 2 days. We've had a similar thing happening in China. We've had similar instances happening in Europe, and we will continue to have similar instances happening in India, where you will have huge quantities of precipitation. Maybe 1 day, 2 days will see as much rainfall as will fall during the entire monsoon or during the entire year. This also we know from climate change is going to be a trend. So in fact, the point of having disaster management structures is to anticipate the scale of disasters that are going to come. If by disaster you only mean a few extra inches of rainfall, that's not great planning that you need to do. You need to anticipate the fact that you are going to get these extreme heat conditions, maybe some extreme cold conditions, but definitely extreme weather conditions, extreme high rainfall conditions, and untimely rainfall conditions, and you need to be prepared for all these. But I will underline once again the fact disaster management can take place only if there is good disaster preparedness. And good disaster preparedness assumes a good infrastructure, physically as well as administratively, that you have in place which can respond to the disaster after it has happened. And in the first place, planned habitation and physical infrastructure which would minimize the extent of the disaster if it...
Coming back to the extreme weather events are on the increase everywhere. Australia, North America, Europe, of course, Asia, as you have talked about. And they are showing themselves in essentially, maybe cyclones, tornadoes, heavy rainfall, heavy precipitation, heavy snowing, unusual snowfalls taking place, for instance, in West Asia. So you really have a whole mixed bag of things that are happening.
Absolutely.
And therefore it does seem to indicate that what the IPCC has been saying, that climate change is going to bring in, before even you see it in terms of temperature increase, even the small temperature increase is going to bring about variability of the weather.
Absolutely.
And that's something that we are beginning to see now across the world.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you, variability of the weather. But we also know, and the IPCC has cautioned us about this, there are some trends which are already set in. One, like I said, in India, for example, is the monsoon dates changing. We also know that the number of hot days will increase. So you will get intensified heat waves. You will also get intensified days of very heavy rainfall or snowfall. That is also known. So these broad trends are known. At the same time, there would be some instances where the opposite may happen also. But like in this case, where you've had a early monsoon, this does not deny the general trend taking
That is
place.
why the variability.
That's right.
Rather than just
one-dimensional thing, but the overall trends of some of these are clear. Like I said, intense rainfall days, very few days with very heavy rainfall, high number of heat wave days. These are trends which we are already
extreme
witnessing.
weather events are already visible even before we can see increased temperature significantly. That's what is coming out in this.
Very much so.
So that both parts of it are there. One is, of course, one should not relate the extreme weather events to the disaster directly, because disaster management and sound ecological planning can address beforehand some of these issues. But nevertheless, in the larger climate change debate, certainly extreme weather events are something that we are beginning to see.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Raghu.